So this week, the Palo Alto City Council approved a work plan to explore a business tax for the 2020 ballot measure. And that idea, in the past, business taxes haven't exactly worked out well for Palo Alto. So here to talk about the subject is former Mayor Pat Burt, who's involved in sub-regional efforts around that topic right now. Pat, thank you so much for being here.
You bet.
So I'm just curious, just to start off with, I know when you were on council, you were interested in the topic and were one of the council colleagues who brought forth a memo about the business registry. What's your current interest in seeing business taxes move forward?
Well, I think we have a pretty unanimous agreement that we have, both locally and regionally, really significant housing and transportation problems that are unmet. And we don't have the resources on a local level, for that matter on regional or state, but on a local level, definitely, to be able to address them adequately. And we started looking at this actually in 2015 in the Measure B discussions, first Karen Holman and then my term as mayor in 2016, where we had a consortium of North and West County cities who negotiated really effectively to, for the first time, get a major portion of the county transportation tax toward our interests, which were focused on Caltrain and the $300+ million that we should be getting for grade separations. But part of that same discussion was, should we be looking at similar measures that we would put on the ballots in our cities in a similar time frame? And that's been percolating. We saw this last election cycle that Mountain View and East Palo Alto did just that,
yeah.
And other cities are talking about it.
Cupertino was trying,
yep.
Then I understand that they withdrew it and they will try again in 2020.
Right, and some of those leaders are part of this informal group.
Yeah.
Pat, you were on the city council in 2009 when the city last tried to do a business tax, the business license tax on gross receipts, and that did not pass, of course. And it's often being talked about as Palo Alto being one of the few cities in the area that does not have a business license tax. And since that measure failed, I just wanted to ask you, are you confident that the current effort will be more successful? And do you have an explanation for why the city doesn't have a business tax at this time, while so many others do?
Well, the business taxes that are in our region up until more recently have actually been very nominal either way. So the fact that we didn't have one didn't matter much because the dollars other cities have been getting are very low. What we've had, to our surprise, when we started researching this, is that Silicon Valley had grown up as an exceptionally low business tax region. The tax rate in San Francisco is now in the neighborhood of 40 times the rate per employee as we average in Silicon Valley. Mm-hmm. And yet, Silicon Valley has some of the most profitable businesses in the world. And we have some of the biggest unmet problems that, frankly, those businesses badly need us to address. So I think there's an historic background to it. Back in the 50s and 60s, if you're a white-collar worker, there's a good chance your corporation was in San Francisco and they charged businesses for the privilege of being there, and that all evolved, and we never reflected on that as our problems escalated. But then you're asking about the 2009. I'd say a couple things. One, that was a general tax. The city manager at that time had really driven it to meet a systemic budget shortfall, principally as a result of escalating pension benefit costs. It wasn't for a specific purpose, and it was 2009, right after the Great Crash. And so I think that the voter sentiment toward additional tax on business, when at that time we were all saying, how do we make sure that we have enough business around here and enough employment? Very different circumstance.
Yeah, whenever we talk about business taxes, there's always the kind of us versus them situation. The businesses, chambers of commerce, Silicon Valley leadership group has come out against taxes, saying that if it's too onerous, then that will drive companies away. So I think the question remains then, how do you strike a good balance for the city of wanting to increase revenues, have companies do their quote unquote fair share without making it so high that they'll just be discouraged from either staying or coming in?
Well, I think it's important to break down kind of that refrain that says, oh, you'll tax these companies out of here. So first, we don't have a problem in this region with attracting business and haven't for some time. We don't have it on the horizon. San Francisco, which charges $1,500 to $2,000 per employee now, doesn't have any problem attracting additional business. What do they have? More than a half a dozen IPOs happening in 2 months. So we'll hear that refrain, but I don't see the reality of it. And then when you look at a couple other things, the amount of tax, if we charged a third of what San Francisco charges, the dollars, that dollar amount would constitute about 1% of what those tech companies are paying in premiums per employee per year to have those employees work here versus in Austin or Atlanta or whatever. Not 1% of what their compensation, 1% of the additional amount that they're paying to have them here. I can tell you, as somebody who has owned and run businesses for 30 years in Silicon Valley, that would not actually show up on the radar.
Okay.
And I want to go back to the sub-regional conversations that, as you mentioned, go back to Measure B. Can you tell me a little more about who is involved in these conversations? And also, you mentioned at a council meeting this week that you guys have some particular ideas about what the revenues should be used for potential business tax. I'm hoping you could talk a little bit about that as well.
Yeah, so back in the Measure B period, the North and West County cities had a loose consortium, and we were meeting regularly starting in 2015. And the cities involved, I'd say the core cities were Palo Alto, Mountain View, Los Altos, and Cupertino. And then we also had participation from Saratoga, Los Gatos, Los Altos Hills, and Sunnyvale. But those first four were the ones who were kind of most united in what they were arguing for and successfully achieved. And then I'm sorry, your second question was what again?
The particular ways that the revenues would be used. So,
yeah.
And just to go back, so you're still talking to kind of officials from these cities, like the ones you just mentioned?
Both activists and officials. Yeah, so there are council members who have said, you know, we want to look at what are these options and can we flush this out as a group and understand more of, do more research and help the cities as they decide what they're going to do individually. Okay. So on the taxes, there's really three big buckets. What you'd use them for, what scale they'd be, how many dollars you'd generate, and what form they would take. And the form has its own segments. Is it what you call a head count tax? Is it a square footage tax? Is it a gross receipts tax? Also questions of if it's a citizen initiative, it has different legal boundaries on what you can do versus if it's a city-led initiative. We had a ruling about 3-4 years ago called the Upland decision that said that if it's a citizen initiative, Prop 218 didn't apply. The first ruling was it didn't apply to the requirement that taxes can only be on general election ballots of Novembers every 2 years. And so a citizen initiative could be on any ballot. In November 2020, it's likely there's going to be a number of tax initiatives, state, regional, and perhaps local level, and that always creates competition, which is part of why we didn't put it on the November 2016 ballot. We didn't want to compete with Measure B. The other thing that hasn't been ruled on, but is right now going through the court system, is that if Prop 218 didn't apply, that Prop 218 said that, you know, if you have a specific tax, it has to be a 2/3 majority. So if you define the uses, and voter support generally goes up if you define the uses better. It also said that it had to be on those general election ballots. They've ruled on the one thing. We're waiting for them to rule on whether the 2/3 majority also doesn't apply. San Francisco and Oakland are pursuing it. They've already passed taxes that were citizen-led, did not achieve 2/3, and they believe, their city attorneys believe, that under this court ruling, it would not require a 2/3 vote. So that would mean that if we had a citizen-led initiative, it would only be 50% plus one, and we could have it not on a general election ballot. That doesn't mean that that's what the city or our group, that's an informal Palo Alto group that was pursuing this, would do. It's just one of the possibilities.
And as far as what the money would be used for, transportation, in particular grade separation, is something that's been getting the bulk of the attention here in Palo Alto. Are these the kind of uses that your group supports? And I assume not just for Palo Alto, because it's a sub-regional group, but is transportation the key focus? Because I think you also mentioned housing, and so I feel like these are two such huge issues that it would be kind of hard to really.
So we've actually had two groups. One was the informal sub-regional group, and the other is a Palo Alto specific group that's been meeting. And I'd say there's a lot of commonality between them, but in the Palo Alto specific one, we've been focusing on two main uses: local transportation and affordable housing. Within the local transportation, there are two big buckets. The biggest dollar one is whatever is the unmet capital need for grade separations. We don't know what that dollar amount is yet, but the $350 million that we expect to get from the county Measure B is not going to be anywhere near enough. It was the big down payment. It was the first time we had a big bucket of money, but it's not a big enough bucket. So we're assuming that the majority of the dollars would go toward that purpose, be bonded to be able to have a very significant dollar amount, probably exceeding what we're getting from the Measure B. So a lot of money. Second is operations in transportation, and this is where there's part of the 2016 discussion we had on the council committee that I led on this, which was the concept of expanding citywide something like our TMA, a citywide trip reduction effort that really has three big benefits: cut down on traffic significantly, cut down on the parking demand significantly, and cut down on greenhouse gas reduction. So you get multiple benefits from the same action. And so you have the operations, and it wouldn't necessarily just be the TMA. It could be that and expanded local shuttle system, but various other things that would do trip reductions in the community.
Now, wouldn't it be, isn't that a lot to kind of, a big bite to have these two buckets, which are already pretty substantive, and then add affordable housing, which, as we know, isn't cheap at all? Like, how does affordable housing get into this equation?
So if we were to assume that we would have a business tax that might be about a third of the rate of San Francisco's, in Palo Alto, that looks like it would generate perhaps over $50 million a year. Really a big dollar amount.
Wow.
So if you were to, just as ballpark placeholder numbers, say that 30 million of that would go toward grade separations, you bond it, that's about 14 to 1, so it's about $450 million bondable dollars. $10 million a year towards citywide TMA and shuttle, and from our ballparking, we could do both of those for $10 million a year, and $10 million toward affordable housing. And my discussions with Palo Alto Housing Corp is that dollar amount would double to triple the amount of affordable housing we could create per year in Palo Alto.
Interesting. Well, $10 million is how much the city council is approving for Wilton Court alone. So it seems to me like that's about how far that would go.
We could do
50, 60
basically
units of affordable housing per year.
Yeah, so right now, with our housing impact fees and otherwise, the portion that, the city puts in a portion, then they leverage that against other funding sources on state and federal level, and even private funding sources. Instead of being able to do a Wilton Court type project maybe once every 3 years, because we did use the other dollars for Buena Vista, and then Wilton Court, and now we've run that bucket dry. We'd be able to do something like that about once a year. So that's the tripling of the rate. And that's what they think. They'd be able to leverage, if it was $10 million a year, they'd be able to do one of those projects every year instead of one every 3 years, roughly.
Okay, the tripling the rate makes sense. I thought you meant like tripling the total amount of affordable housing Palo Alto currently has, which would
tripling
take a lot more units.
how much
so
we
go much faster,
we build per year.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Do you have any a hope that you can actually bring businesses, the chamber, kind of on board in supporting a business tax measure if it goes to, for example, services that would benefit its employees?
So when the chamber spoke at the council meeting the other evening, they said, well, if it's a specific tax, they would be supportive. what other cities have done recently is they did a general tax with an accompanying advisory measure, and that only requires the 50+1.
Which is a tactic Palo Alto has used in recent.
That's right. Lots of cities do it. It's a political obligation to use it for the stated purposes rather than a legal obligation. It polls higher to have a specific tax, but you only need 50+1 for the general tax and 2/3 for the specific. So if I remember the polling that we did in 2016, we got about close to 65% for a specific tax that at that time was focused on the local transportation, although I brought up the affordable housing at that time. And I think it was about 58% if it was a general tax with an advisory measure. So even though it polls higher for the specific, it would lose, in theory, narrowly, but the general tax would win.
Right.
There's still a lot more work to be done on this. So we don't know. I suspect strongly that the voter sentiment toward holding big tech business accountable for their fair share has gone up over the last 3 years appreciably. We've seen other kind of polls. Unfortunately, we didn't have good baseline comparison, so it's not an apples to apples. But all the trends seem to be that the electorate is saying we have big problems. We don't think that big tech is doing their fair share, and we're supportive of doing that. Which goes into this other issue on kind of the form, which is all these business taxes in cities have carve-outs of either discounts or exemptions for small businesses, retail, small nonprofits. That will be part of the details that have to be ironed out. And in reality, there's no perfect tax. This is part of the problem in 2009 and part of my concern with the business community. We tried in 2009 to hear the concerns of the business community and change the model in response to them. And each time we changed the model, they came up with new concerns that were contradictory to their first ones. And it goes back to the point, there's no tax that's going to be perfect. And we will be able to have reasonable arguments against any tax that anybody can come up with. Mm-hmm. And they're about fairness and equity and uses and all those things. So in the end, what we have to do is come up with something that is fair enough that the electorate will support it.
Mm-hmm. Great. Well, we're running out of time, but I did want to ask if there's anything additional that you want to say about the subject or about what's happening right now and politically.
Well, I would say that one of the most important things about this effort is that it is what local communities can do to address these big problems that are the alternative approach to kind of this autocratic one-size-fits-all that is trying to come out of Sacramento. SB 50 and a whole bunch of other legislation that's similar in kind that is a very radical approach to take away huge portions of the land use decision-making for communities and concentrate it in Sacramento, one-size-fits-all. And it's going to be up to local jurisdictions to show that they can do real meaningful ways that they address the real problems, which in our case, you know, it's on the housing side, there's both the market rate housing issue and the affordable housing crisis. I'd say that, you know, for somebody making $200,000 a year who has to spend $4,000 a month on rent, that's a problem. For somebody who makes $70,000 a year who has to spend $30,000 or $40,000, $3,000 or $4,000 a month on rent, that's a crisis. And we want to focus on the biggest problem.
Mm-hmm. And through funding, through a business tax, then that'll enable local jurisdictions to further their specific goals.
The biggest change we've had in a long while. I won't claim that it's a total solution, but we've done a lot of other things in this community to address that, and it takes a few years to filter through the system. Unfortunately, you can enact legislation, and it's not the next day the full impact of that legislation's happened. So between our restrictions on the demand side, reducing office growth, and our upzoning for market rate housing in our downtown areas, our affordable housing overlays, which had a big impact on the Wilton Court project, our ADU ordinance. We have a number of measures that are actually moving in the right direction, but we need this as well.
Okay. All right. Pat Burt, thank you so much for
welcome.
joining us today.
Thanks.
That wraps up this edition of Behind the Headlines. To follow this issue and all Palo Alto news, go to paloaltoonline.com. We also have a daily email newsletter. It's free. You can subscribe to Express by going to paloaltoonline.com/express. We'll see you next week.